All right, so this week what I want to do is introduce American Zen. I'm going to spend much less time talking about it and give you an opportunity to explore some things on your own, hopefully. I'm going to spend the first discussion taking a look at a few of the main characters who brought Zen to the United States or who went to Asia, largely Japan, to study Zen. And then I'm going to take a look in the next discussion at some writers and poets who were very influenced by Zen, as well as other forms of Buddhism. And then I'm going to take a look on the third day this week at a Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, who is very influenced by Zen and who is part of the dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism. The last day, there's not going to be a recording by me. I'm just going to have you take a look at a documentary about Thich Nhat Hanh. I think it's a good way to round out the course, bring us back full circle to the beginning. So again, this week, what I have to say is going to be fairly short, hopefully. It's just going to be a short introduction to each of these figures and a little bit longer on Thomas Merton. But overall, a fairly short introduction on these figures, and then give you an opportunity to explore some of the writings and some of the videos that I've had posted to give you a sense of Zen in the United States. One thing I want to say is that I've chosen a few people, right? These are some representatives, some of the major representatives, but of course I could have picked other people. The history of Zen in the United States is rich, and there are a number of individuals that helped bring Zen to the United States. Another thing I want to note is the representation here is almost exclusively. I think I have one exception to this, male. Just like we've seen so far in Buddhism, there's a strong male dominance, and that continued through the early years of Zen Buddhism in the United States and continues, I would say, today. There have been some very significant exceptions to that, but it's something that Zen has struggled with, and so I want to highlight that. So today, again, I'm going to look at sort of what I might consider the pioneers in bringing Zen to the United States. So let's go ahead and get started. So I begin here with what's called the World's Parliament of Religions, and this was an event that occurred in 1893. There have been more recent World Parliaments of Religions that began at the centennial of this event, but this is sort of the event that started it all. This isn't the first introduction of Buddhism to the United States. We hear in people like Henry David Thoreau and Emerson and others influence from Buddhism, translation of texts, reading of Sanskrit texts, and so on. And so it's not the first introduction, but as a sort of an event, something that brought figures, representatives who would attempt to actually establish Zen and Buddhism as a whole in the United States. This is the event that we can turn to. This event was the first of its kind to bring world religions in a broad way together to discuss faith, right? To discuss religion, to discuss spirituality, and so on. It was largely Westerners with a sized minority of Eastern thinkers, as well as including some people from India. Absent, as I note there, were Native Americans, right? This was done in Chicago, but there was not a representation of Native American religion or spirituality. And also of note, there was no representation of Native African religion or spirituality, right? So while in one sense it sort of blew things wide open, it was still exclusionary in another sense. So at the event, there were representatives from basically all the Buddhist traditions. So that included Theravada, Tibetan, as well as the devotional schools that we talked about, such as Pure Land. And Zen had a small but significant representation at the event. And at this event, there's a figure, Vivekananda, who was central in bringing Hinduism into the United States. So we can see this sort of as a moment of bringing world religions to the United States, to a new audience, and the spread from Vivekananda's work was very successful. But of course, what's important for us is the spread of Buddhism, and in particular for this discussion is the spread of Zen. So Soyen Shaku, who we'll talk about in a minute, was the primary representative of Zen at the conference. So we can see his information there. He was born in 1860 and died in 1919. He, as a young Buddhist student, Zen student, he decided to study Pali, so kind of go back to the sources in a sense, and went to Sri Lanka to do that. Then returned to Japan in '93. He went with 5 others to represent Japanese Buddhism. So that included, again, Zen as well as Pure Land Buddhism and esoteric schools. He gave 2 talks at the conference. They were actually read by someone else, but they were written by Soyen Shaku and translated by G.T. Suzuki, who we'll speak about in just a moment. And then they were presented at the conference. He has 2 books that are intended for Western and primarily Indians, trying to introduce Zen and Mahayana Buddhism in general to the United States. So you can, I think the one's called Zen for Americans or something of that nature. So he continued to write and produce material for an American audience. So after the Parliament, he returned to Japan, but came back to the United States on 2 different occasions, once in 1902, the other time in 1905 to 06. And while he spent most of his time with the family teaching them, he did go on a speaking tour. So was able to spread Buddhism in that way as well. I mentioned here Ida Russell, so one of the individuals that he was staying with would have been the first woman to ever study koans in the United States. Sort of historically, we can say, hey, here's the first time that we can locate a woman studying koans in the United States, and it was Soyen Shaku who brought the teachings to the family. So Soyen Shaku had a student, move this along, by the name of D.T. Suzuki. And while he was not very well known during the Parliament, right, this was sort of his first introduction to the Western world, he became very well known. He was sent later on by his teacher, by Soyen Shaku, to the United States to teach. Asked him to go to the United States, to remain, and to try to bring Buddhism to the United States. He spent a significant amount of time translating, trying to bring Chinese and Japanese texts into English so they could be studied by American Buddhists or those interested in Buddhism. He taught at Columbia for 5 years. And in our next discussion, I won't talk about it too explicitly, but this is important because the Beat Poets, many of them went to Columbia and were very influenced by D.T. Suzuki, by reading his works and so on. So that connection is also important there. Suzuki strongly emphasized the idea of Satori, S-A-T-O-R-I, right? So the enlightenment experience. So this kind of seismic shift in consciousness that occurs after practice of Zen, right? And that's the goal, that's the purpose of Zen. Suzuki was interested in other forms of spirituality, including Christian mysticism, and he wrote on Meister Eckhart, the Rhineland mystic, and this will become important for our discussion with Thomas Merton. D.T. Suzuki and Thomas Merton had a discussion, had an exchange, and Thomas Merton actually met with him while he was at Columbia. And so that's important for that part of the story. He's known for bringing Zen to the West, right? For being this great translator and writer on all things Zen. But in his own personal spiritual journey, he was drawn more and more towards the devotional schools of Buddhism, in particular Pure Land Buddhism. And that became his primary form of spiritual practice. Reciting the Amitabha Buddha and seeking entrance into a pure land and so on. Right, that became his goal. And so although he's known for one thing, his own spiritual life moved him in a different direction. I do want to mention, because it's important, I think, to recognize these things as part of history. It's part of the individual. It's part of what was going on. Is that he did have some very significant nationalistic tendencies. You can see this in his writings, and there are places where he had Nazi sympathies. And even some places of anti-Semitic comments. And of course, looking at these can very much complicate an individual, but I also think it's important to recognize that, to not try to gloss over things that are part of his history. So that's D.T. Suzuki. So Suzuki's not going away. Right? I mean, he's going to be an important aspect of much of what we talk about from here on out. When later we talk about the little Suzuki, Shunju Suzuki, when he calls himself the little Suzuki, he's comparing himself to D.T. Suzuki, the big Suzuki. So Sokayon, also connected to Suzuki, was another important figure in bringing Zen to the United States. He came to the United States as a representative of Rinzai Buddhism to a temple that was in San Francisco, and he is part of this sort of great Rinzai lineage, right? That began with Soyen Shaku and D.T. Suzuki, and Sokayon continued that same lineage in the United States. You can sort of see them as this sort of ongoing presence of Rinzai Zen. He began well, obviously he began in San Francisco, but then moved to the Northwest, to Oregon and to Washington. And his family went back to Japan, and he remained in the United States and found his way eventually to New York City. And in New York City, he established the first Zen Institute, called it the Buddhist Society of America, later retermed the first Zen Institute. And there he began to teach Ruth Fuller, who he would later marry just before he died. And he also taught Alan Watts there. So we'll talk about Alan Watts next time. He was interred during World War II. As you can see, it was towards the end of his life. His health wasn't very good, and his students convinced the government to allow his release, and so he was released after a few months of being interred, and was able to spend the rest of his days at his temple. His tradition, as I said, was Rinzai, and so his primary method of teaching was using koans in the interview process, right? Here I give you this koan, you work on this koan for a while, you try to bring an answer back to me, and I, tell you, good job, here's a new koan, or no, you got to keep working on it, right? So anyway, that's Sokayon. And again, part of the sort of big three of the Rinzai tradition being established in the United States. So here's Ruth Fuller Sasaki, who I already mentioned. So Fuller went to Japan in 1930, and she met Suzuki there, and began her interest in Zen at that time. She had been studying Indian thought at the University of Chicago. She was an early supporter of the first Zen Institute. She was part of its leadership during this time and forming it, and became an important part of bringing that institute actually back to Japan, where it became a place for American students. So American students would travel to Japan to study Zen, but many would study at the first Zen Institute in Japan while she was there under the direction of Ruth Fuller. So when she was in Japan, she was ordained as a priest. Although her sort of leadership role at the temple that she's ordained at limited, largely because she was an American and probably also because she was a woman. But she did receive ordainment, and that allowed her to open her own institution, right? To have her own place of study, which let her bring people from the West to study Zen in Japan. She developed a kind of a group of scholars, of translators, and brought them together to begin translating Japanese texts. So continuing much of the work that we saw with people like D.T. Suzuki and so on. And so she was trying to sort of turn these things out so they would be available to English speakers. Just as a sort of historically interesting note and another connection, her daughter, Eleanor Everett, was married to Alan Watts for 10 years. So we have a sort of a family connection there as well. So that is Ruth Fuller. Philip Kapleau. So Philip Kapleau also has a D.T. Suzuki connection. He went to Japan as a journalist, cover war crimes trials. And there he met Suzuki and attended Suzuki's lectures and became interested in Buddhism at that time. When he came back to the United States, he met with Suzuki again when Suzuki was in the United States. but found he needed to leave the United States, to go to Japan, to try to find kind of an authentic teacher and experience. And so Kapleau went to Japan in 1953 to seek a teacher. He stayed in Japan for quite a while. He had a disagreement with his teacher, and so returned to the United States. He had been ordained, but he hadn't completed his transmission. But he returned to the United States, and when he returned, he began teaching. He opened the Rochester Zen Center and taught in a tradition called the Sanbo Kyudan. It's a more recent tradition developed by his teacher, and the idea, while grounded in Soto Zen, is to bring in many of the insights of Rinzai Zen, incorporates much more koan study and so on. So it's sort of a hybrid, bringing together the two main traditions. But that's the tradition that Kapleau taught in. He also found that Zen was something that we could find the essence of, and try to adapt it, to the particular circumstances of the community, of where it's being taught. And so a teacher, may be teaching Japanese students, or might be teaching American students, and have to teach in somewhat different ways. I think he remained aware of the importance of various elements of Buddhism. So he wasn't trying to say, oh, well, it's all just about mindfulness or whatever. But he tried to develop a tradition that was more conducive to sort of an American environment. Something I think it's sort of interesting, he uses this term grist for the mill, right? It was a very common term that he used, or phrase, saying that everything in our life, right, is given to us, all the suffering, all the dukkha, right? What is that? Well, that's as he says, is grist for the mill. It gives us the opportunity for awakening. So all of life, in a sense, is a koan, which is very Soto in outlook. So that's Philip Kapleau. And I should say Philip Kapleau has written on the history of Zen. So, if you're interested in the United States, right? So if you're interested in that, he has written some on the history of Zen in the United States. Okay, and then finally to Shunju Suzuki. Shunju Suzuki, again, call himself Little Suzuki. His teacher called him Crooked Cucumber, kind of a jab at him. He had a very close relationship with his teacher, but his teacher was very strict, and at least according to the teacher's description, Suzuki could be forgetful, a bit absent-minded, and so he was dubbed the Crooked Cucumber. So he established the San Francisco Zen Center in 1959 after moving to the United States. He began his study of Zen at the age of 12, and after spending years with his teacher sent him to study at a couple of monasteries to get a broader sort of experience. He also studied Rinzai Zen at the request of his teacher, but he spent longer periods of time at Aihaiji and Sochiji, so Dogen's monastery and Kaizen's monastery, to remind us, and so had sort of a more well-rounded Zen education through those experiences. And then he also went and studied at Komazawa University, which is a centuries-old Soto Zen university. He studied English there as well as Zen philosophy. So he developed his proficiency in English while there, And then in 1959, he traveled to the United States, to San Francisco, to head the Zen temple there, the Soto Zen temple. And while he was there, he was invited to attend this class on Buddhism. So imagine now taking this class, an in-person class, obviously, but we went to Buddhism class at the American Academy of Asian Studies, which was this sort of it was an organization that was trying to be kind of an alternative to other schools, and looking to Asian thought to found it. So there was a class on Buddhism there, and he was invited to attend it. And so he went to the class, but he also participated. And he led the students in regular meditation, and then he invited them to Sokoji, to the temple. And so many of the students started going to Sokoji, and eventually this led to problems, where he had essentially two groups of people that were meditating at Sokoji, the immigrants that had been attending the temple, and then the new American students that were showing up. And so eventually he ended up breaking with the original temple, and establishing the San Francisco Zen Center, which was geared towards a broader American audience. I should say fully, so Philly committed himself fully to the San Francisco Zen Center. He also helped establish the Tassajara Zen Mountain Center, which is connected with the San Francisco Zen Center and is the first Zen monastery, excuse me, in the United States. So that was in 1966. And he's had an ongoing impact. If you read the history of the San Francisco Zen Center, it's had over the years significant problems, but those problems arose, after Suzuki's passing. Suzuki has been connected with many of the people we'll be talking about next time, the beat poets, and their connection with the San Francisco Renaissance brought them to San Francisco, and many of them were very attracted to Buddhism and began sitting with the San Francisco Zen Center. And so Suzuki played a major role in that sort of spiritual process of those writers and poets. So that is Sunju Suzuki. So again, next time we'll take a look at some writers and poets who have been influenced by Buddhism, and many of whom consider themselves to be Buddhist or considered themselves to be Buddhist. So we'll kind of pick up this story at kind of from a different angle, right? So much of this was coming from outside of Japan into the United States, with the exception of Ruth Fuller and Philip Kapleau. And next time we'll be looking at people, American writers, as well as Alan Watts, who's British, but spent his life in the United States, and their approach to Zen. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll pick up our story next time.